Hey, Rocky.
Hey, Jords.
What are we talking about today, bud?
I'm so glad you asked. Uh, because, Jordan, long ago,
Mm.
the four nations lived together in
But
harmony.
then what?
And then everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
What?
Only the Avatar,
Yeah,
master of all four
yeah.
elements, could stop them. But
Where was he?
when the world needed him most, he vanished.
Where?
100 years passed, and Katara's brother and Katara discovered the new avatar, an airbender named Aang. And although his airbending skills are great,
Yeah.
he still has a lot to learn before
Oh,
he's ready to save anyone. But I believe
what do you believe?
Aang can save the world.
All right, now in this audio format, we need like a wicked zoom out of a figure standing on like a precipice.
Big clouds in the sky, big world map.
If
The
only we
four
had some way of
nations.
inserting a sound effect to go with this. As like a zoom. With some real epic sounding music, yeah.
You can just make the sound effects. That's okay.
Oh, sick.
Yeah, so today we are talking about Avatar The Last Airbender. We're going to try and figure out how you would run a really sick Avatar The Last Airbender session in a role playing game of your choice. I have some hot takes about that, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Good forward
Um,
sizzle.
but we're going to spend most of our chat today trying to nail down exactly what it is we are trying to achieve here. What is the vibe that an avatar session could nail? Make sure that those vibes come to the table, and then right at the very tippy tippy tail, we are going to have a quick chat about systems.
This is a hot topic right now because Netflix has just released the live action Avatar series. So I feel like this could be a time where people who have never experienced Avatar might get into it. So if we want to take it back to 2002, this show was coming out week by week on Nickelodeon. What makes it it? What gives its identity? What are the story anchors for Avatar The Last Airbender?
Okay, there is a reason that I started this episode by reading the opening monologue, because this was an episodic show. You were going to have kids dropping in and dropping out every week, and so every week you kind of have to reintroduce the broad concept of the show. And so I sat down and I wrote a lot of notes about what I thought Avatar The Last Airbender should be like. And what I landed on was essentially a riff on what's in that opening monologue. You want to master all four elements and bring balance to the world. And I'm just going to fanboy for a second.
Just 1 second.
Well, no, a little bit longer, probably like an hour. It's an example of just how tightly designed this whole show is. That opening monologue actually does give you the themes of the show in under 30 seconds. So yeah, I think the big pillars of Avatar The Last Airbender are that you are mastering the elements and you are bringing balance to the world, and those unpack into a bunch of little sub vibes really neatly. But I think that's essentially it.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any thoughts on what you think the show is about in terms of really big overarching stuff?
Now, this is one of those rare occasions where we have entirely flip flopped in our roles. Because where you have gone for big story premise overall, I'm going to drill down into the nitty gritty here. I think if it's going to be a Last Airbender role playing session for me, then it has to be super tightly character focused. And it's about facing moral dilemmas for those characters, like intrinsic drives and philosophies. And like those philosophies are kind of broadly abstracted to like the entire nations. They all live in a different way and they all have certain beliefs, but then the individual drives within them as well have a bit of nuance in there. So I think if the characters aren't being challenged in the way that they believe the world should work and how they should solve that problem, it wouldn't be Avatar: The Last Airbender to me.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of the show. So, at the core of every single episode is essentially a moral quandary, right? There is a moral question that leads to tension between the characters, between the protagonists, and between the protagonists and the NPCs, if you like,
Mhm.
but also within the protagonists as they kind of decide on what the right thing to do is. It is at its core, it's a show about deciding what the right thing to do is more than it is about necessarily doing that thing. And all of the tension in the show, it doesn't come from like, can they do the thing? Because Aang is by definition the most powerful bender in the world. Like if
Mhm.
he needs to do the thing, he can do the thing. And if he can't do the thing, then the script writers will like make up some avatar powers so that
Yeah,
he can
he
do the thing.
literally types in God mode cheat and does the thing.
Um, So, like, the
Mm.
challenge in each episode is figuring out what the right thing to do is, and sometimes they get it wrong, and sometimes it's still unclear about whether what they chose to do was the right thing.
One of the things that I love is that it's also very self-aware. Like it doesn't treat its audience like children. It goes for some pretty deep character themes and developments and puts them in quite difficult positions. Some characters have this more pronounced than others, but each and every single one of them goes on a journey. And if in your role-playing session your character is the same at the end of the session as they were at the start, I think you haven't hit the tone at all. Like
Yeah,
your character has to evolve and their beliefs have to be challenged and either reinforced or changed based on the circumstances.
yeah, and again, I come back to the opening monologue. It's like they have a lot to learn before they're ready to save anyone. It is a show about these people becoming who they will be, if that makes
Mm.
sense. It is, yeah, it is. It sounds like stupid and cliched, but it is a show about growing up, right?
Mm.
Like it is a show about figuring out who you want to be and how you want to relate to this world. And in a lot of ways, like once the characters do figure out who they are and who they want to be, the show is over, right? Like once Zuko figures out who he is, like that's the end of the show. Once Aang figures out who he is, that's the end of the show. And we don't come back to that universe. We don't come back to that part of the timeline.
Aang's life post Fire Lord is not actually the interesting bit. The interesting bit is when he's 12 and 13 years old and he's coming to grips with being the last surviving member of a race who's undergone genocide.
Yeah. Which is like it's really heavy stuff.
Oh, yeah. And like
Um
that's not really addressed in that way when you're 12. But I think it's just more power to the show for being able to tackle these really big themes and show his grief and journey through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is a show about growing and changing and becoming rather than just being. And I think that plays into one of the more concrete things that you would want out of this universe, which is, of course, the bending.
Mm.
So yeah, just like the characters figure out who they are along the way, I think it's really important that you and the characters are also learning more and more about bending. So Aang, when we come into the show, has not mastered all four elements. Katara has not mastered water yet. We don't even know any earthbenders, and we definitely don't have a firebender on the team. Firebender is like code for bad guy in the first half of the show. And as the show goes on, not only do we, the audience, learn more about bending, but the characters learn more about bending as well, and they start to master their
Mhm.
respective element.
And that
And
mastery comes from like each element has a unique way of connecting with it that's very different and sometimes in opposition. But then I think one of the most beautiful things is when they start borrowing techniques from other bending disciplines and be like, wow, even though I'm ethnically this type of person, I can draw on the wisdom of this culture and enhance myself. Diversity brings strength.
yeah, I think it's really important. The bending is really important to the show. But more important than just like having bending, I think, is learning bending.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that it is a show about learning who you are, it is also a show about mastering your technique. What? mastering your craft, mastering your like, what's the word I'm looking for here?
I want to say mastering your discipline.
Yeah, no, that is it.
Yeah, yeah.
It is a show about like mastering your discipline, and you're right. They all learn in different ways. They learn from each other. A huge part of the show is about like seeking out masters,
Mm-hmm.
seeking out sources of wisdom. You have the various firebending teachers that Aang tries to learn from, and eventually ends up like learning from Zuko and the dragons. You have like a huge part of like the first season is obviously around the waterbending scroll, and both Aang and Katara like learning to master water together. It's like so much of what the characters' drives are revolves around mastering the elements. They're not necessarily setting out to grow as people, but they are setting out to master their discipline. So that is
Mm-hmm.
a much more like active conscious drive that they have. One of the reasons that they are traveling around the world to all of these places is not just to right wrongs. They are always in the background, like seeking to improve their skills.
Enhance themselves, self-actualize.
Yeah, I think it's great that the show is that explicit about it, and how the explicit seeking of skills ties so neatly into the character growth. The characters are not setting out to grow, but they are setting out to, become better benders, and they become better people along the way.
One of the things that I do love about this paradigm of story as well, that's quite different to your trad RPGs. In your trad RPGs, you kill enough stuff, and then suddenly you're just better. Like new abilities just appear on your
They just
character sheet. But in this one, it's like, oh no, it is genuine discipline. You go out, you find someone who knows more, you learn, you practice new techniques all the time, and the growth is very organic and not so abrupt.
mm,
Like it's all tied to the narrative.
yeah. I think another thing that we've kind of touched on a bit is that this is very uniquely, I think, among kids shows and cartoon shows, it's a very archy show. And yes, within each episode, they're very careful to make sure that like everyone gets a little bit of growth each episode. Everyone learns something along the way. The show really comes into its own in the fact that it is taking its time to step out
Mm-hmm.
these stories. You look at where they are at the end of season 3 and where they are at the start of season 1, and there is a smooth line connecting those 2 points, and you almost don't notice it along the way because the growth in each episode is so incremental. But
Like their big threat was one firebender at the start,
yeah,
and then like,
to be fair, the threat at the end is still one firebender.
oh no, the threat at the end is like 17 airships full of firebenders with a meteor in the sky enhancing their power.
I mean,
They're just
I was thinking of Ozai,
yeah,
and
fair.
his like thermonuclear forest destroying rocket boot. Like the threat is still one firebender, but like what a firebender,
Oh, what a firebender! So handsome.
fire daddy.
So what you've just said about the time that it takes for these characters to develop, I think is really important for how we would play this out at the table as well. Where most episodes we're talking about how would we do this in like a one shot, like a 3-4 hour session. I think in this case, I wouldn't even start with that approach because while that character growth is so incremental and you might be lightly different from the start of one play session to the next, I think you really want that long term arc. You want like a dozen sessions, like a couple of months of playtime to really see that character through, and then have that end of your arc compared to the start of your arc and see the journey that your character's gone on there and how you as the player have evolved your thinking in that character's shoes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be really hard to get the Avatar vibe in just one session. The joy of the show is that we come back to these characters week after week, and we get to watch them grow, and that needs to be the joy of the game as well.
The other thing I think that's really important, you said this quite a while back, but there is intra-party conflict. The members of the party are fighting against each other's ideals and trying to show their respective points of view. If you do that in a one-shot session, I think it can only finish lamely. I don't think there's a way that you can make that expressed and capitalize on it in the same tight time frame.
Yeah, because so much of it is a tit for tat, and there's almost a subtle scorekeeping that's happening in the background, where maybe we do things Aang's way one episode, and Zuko learns from that, and then a couple of episodes down the track, we do things Zuko's way, and Aang learns something from him,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's really hard to do that in a one shot in a way that doesn't feel like you're picking a winner.
Yeah, that's a
It's like,
great way of framing it. Literally everyone goes on a journey.
yeah,
So like
both.
if you can only have one character going on a journey in a session, you can't do this in one session and do it justice. You're going to
Yeah,
have everyone except one disappointed players at the table.
yeah, absolutely. And I think you've actually touched on maybe my last sort of big point there really neatly as well, which is that there's like all of this really rich lore that we learn slowly throughout the show as the characters do. So we,
Mm-hmm.
as an audience, learn it along with the characters. And so, again, not only are the characters richer by the end of the show, but also the world is richer, right? Like we come into
Mm-hmm.
this world and it's very, very constrained. It's
One
um,
little village from a mostly destroyed tribe.
yeah, and we know that there are people who can bend the elements, and there's one person who can bend all four, and that the firebenders are the bad guys. And it's this very like simplistic little universe. And some cartoons would just stay there.
Mm-hmm.
By the end, we get to the final sort of little arc of episodes, and suddenly it's like, well, yeah, you've got Sozin's Comet and the Day of the Black Sun in play. You have this whole spirit world sort of subplot that's been worked throughout the series. You have all of this stuff about the White Lotus that has been like revealed throughout the series. You have these mythical creatures. You have badger moles and lion turtles and dragons, like
Dragons.
literal dragons.
And a
Um,
bear, just a regular bear.
the craziest creature of all, just a regular bear.
My favorite throwaway line: like a spider fly caught in its own web.
But yeah, that's by the end of the show, that becomes such an integral part of the texture
Mm.
of this world. It's expanded outwards, but it's also become so beautifully detailed. We've learned all of this stuff about how the cosmology works, but we've also learned about, spider flies. I think that spider fly line is a great one because we know that the world has these hybrid animals, right? And only someone who lives in the Avatar world
Mm.
could have come up with that metaphor. And only someone who has learned that that's how the animals in this show are by watching turtle ducks and polar bear dogs and all of these animals show up again and again is going to appreciate that metaphor as a viewer. And so I think my last big sort of pillar is like we have an incredibly rich world both on the big lore front but also the like fun details front, and
Mm-hmm.
I would be disappointed if we just showed up and it was in the game and it was just like there's a village and you save the village with your bending. And we didn't meet some weird animals along the way. We were traveling around and exploring that world and meeting spirits and seeing the weird
Mm-hmm.
animals and, you know, riding the transport system in Omashu. Like you want to spend time in this world. That's why you're playing this game and
Yeah,
not just a
I don't
martial
want it
arts
to
beat 'em
be
up.
Euro
I
Fantasy Village 4.
exactly. I want the texture.
Now, there's one last thing that I think is worth mentioning as well. We learn about different time periods through the show as well. In these time periods, we also learn how things are significantly different and the overarching themes are quite different. So I think for this game session, or this campaign that we're talking about, to be a great Last Airbender story, I think it has to be in the time frame of those characters, where the themes of the show are most prominent.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Korra, very different themes. There's also some quite excellent prequel books set in the time of Kyoshi, and then the previous heir avatar Yang Chen. And the Kyoshi books are like incredibly violent. And it is a lawless time, and Kyoshi is bringing balance to the world like by force, and she essentially has like a band of thugs, and is more or less like an
Yeah.
outlaw avatar.
She is the
Um,
hammer
she
where
like
Aang bends like water.
exactly. And then you go back a little bit further, and the Yang Chen books are all political intrigue. She barely does any airbending or any kind of bending at all. There's this 2-book sort of arc of Yang Chen politically manipulating, but also like she uses spies, she lies to people, she deceives, she manipulates, like she politics the shit out of it.
Which is
Um,
just not Aang at all.
which is not, again, same universe. It's great that that setting is that flexible. And I think after you run your Last Airbender campaign, you should jump into a different era and like run a political intrigue campaign in the
Yeah.
same world. But like,
When I
you,
think
you
Last
have
Airbender, I don't think political intrigue. I think
exactly.
tiny stories centered around the characters and the people they're interacting with,
It's
not maneuvering players on the chessboard.
exactly. It's you learn bending, you fight an injustice, you make a hard choice, you travel the world, you
Mhm.
discover some lore, you grow as a character. The real joy was the friends you made along the way. And look, along the way, you see some silly hybrid animals and a man who's just really unlucky at selling cabbages. And like
Mhm.
that's the show. It's not, yeah, it's not any of these other things that it could be.
One of the things I just adore about this show is all of these tiny stories that take place culminate in having, like, we get towards the end of the arc, and suddenly you look back at all the people that they've helped, and they're all there ready to help them out.
Mm.
Like, they have assembled their crew bit by bit, tiny fractions at a time. There's not like, I won a legion and now I'm going to take this legion to battle. It's, I've got 12 swamp bending friends and they are critical to my plan.
You're right, and the friends you make along the way are as much little bits that you add to your character sheet, I suppose,
Mm.
as the morals that you learn and the bending that you learn. Because yeah, you're right. That all those connections from all those little villages, like they all show up for you when you need them. They all become a resource that you can call on. Shall we talk about how do we prep this? I think
All right.
just to like kick back to one thing we have already mentioned, I do think this is a game that will really reward a campaign rather than a one shot.
Mhm.
So I think that's probably where we should sort of
Yeah.
target our thinking on that front.
I think it's also worth letting the listeners know, when I say campaign, I'm not talking 2 years. I'm not talking your classic 5e, like, oh no, we're going 1 to 20 on this bad boy. No, I'm talking like 10 sessions.
Maybe campaign is the wrong word. Maybe they're
No, I
seasons.
think we just need to reclaim the word campaign.
No, I think we need a new word that makes people think of the thing that we want, and I think the word we're looking for is seasons. It's like
All
this
right.
is a 3-season show or a 4-season like just structurally we're used to stories being in that shape. Seasons have an arc and seasons have a season finale, where campaign implies a different kind of story. I think it's one that's very tied to D&D's wargaming roots. Like a campaign stretches on whereas a season ends. Right?
That's a good frame. I can't argue with that.
I would have a pretty clear sort of outcome that we're expecting as the big season finale. And I would make it very clear that like we can't tackle that yet. And
Mhm.
the point of this season is to play to the point where we can, building our skills and allies and selves to the point where we can take that on.
There's one thing that I think is worth building into this structure as well. And I ran Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus as one of my first big like GM journeys in D&D. The characters in that one are going up against a fallen angel who's now an archdevil. And as it's written, you don't actually see that major villain until the very end. which means the characters have no ties to that villain. And if you look at the show and how the show handles Fire Lord Ozai, he's actually present. We see him all the time. They do this excellent job in the first 2 seasons of masking his face so you only see his like chin goatee, and he's just a menacing presence, but he's on screen. And like, even though Aang has never met him, they don't even know what he looks like. You as the audience member do, and you tie that villain to the story, whatever the tiny actions that those players are doing at the time. You know that it sits against this broader villain backdrop. So I think in the structure, you've got to have some way of having that villain be present, not just in the finale.
Yeah, absolutely. So what does making an emotional learning arc look like in terms of prep? What are we actually going to sit down and write on? Look, I'm just, by this point, I'm just assuming we're using index cards. So like, right, like we're in the pocket of big index card. Maybe we should get some index card sponsors. I don't know.
Yeah, we could get maybe like a packet of index cards per episode. That'd last us.
That'd last us one episode. No, so
Okay,
like,
I
what are
got
we?
some feels on this.
What are we writing on our index cards, and how are we arranging them?
Even before we get to the index cards, I
All
think
right.
this is a starting from the end and starting from the front at the same time. Starting from the end is we're deciding what the big finish is going to be that everything has to build towards. We're not going to find out what the big finish is, like in sandbox play, when the big finish evolves through the player's actions. In this case, I don't think that's it. I think we're like, oh yeah, the showdown with Fire Lord Ozai is the big finish. We know that that's the pivotal thing that the story revolves around.
Aang will save the world.
Yep. Then we kind of break that down into like, what are the arcs for each of those seasons going to look like? And what's the thematic backdrop of them? So, like, to make the story nice and consistent when you're coming back to it session after session, each of those sub arcs should have the same backdrop that you're playing against. And maybe it's like this one is helping individuals who have been impacted by war, is the theme. Maybe the next one is dealing with imperialist consequences and like clash of cultures of occupier versus native. And then the bit that we attack from the front, which I think is going to be the biggest prep, is ensuring your party is properly equipped to have intra-party conflict and play in those themes. Because so much of making a good campaign work comes from session zero, where we're building the characters and, more importantly, building the party, the intra-party relationships between those characters to make them work in the world that they're playing in.
Yeah, absolutely. And the characters definitely have to be very open to learning about each other's values, because again, that's what they do in the show, is they don't know who each other are to start with. So I don't think you need to sit down and like, my character is this and I believe this. Like, that can come out through play. I do think you as a game master need to have an idea of what each character's sort of values are.
Absolutely.
And I think maybe the way I would design the campaign, like the thing I'm writing on the index cards, is that we have this season's big theme, and then we look at the characters' values and we find a scenario that intersects at least one character's set of values, ideally more than one, with that big theme. Again, ideally in a way that creates conflict within the characters or between the characters or between the
That's
party and the world, right? Like,
exactly how I would have gone about it. It's like, I'm not planning out every session at the start of the campaign. I'm planning one session ahead. I know what my background theme is, and I've got the character drives in front of me. And then I'm sitting down, and my fun pattern matching skills are, this person's drive is about like honor is always right, and this person's drive is about the rules should be bent for the greatest good. And it's like, okay, let's find a story that works against those two elements.
right. And our like overarching theme for this one is I don't know, like the hidden consequences of war, right? Like what it looks like to be at war for the people who are not on the front lines.
Yep.
And so, okay, how can we find something that is about a conflict between rigorous, adherence to honor and like bending the rules that touches on this theme of like behind the front lines. And even as I'm like making this up on the fly, I'm like the stories immediately start to drop out, and it's
Yep.
things about like there's some deserters, or like a Ronin type figure who
Hmm.
has like abandoned his unit. Um, and
Some once
what do we?
honorable warriors have turned to banditry to survive.
Yeah, or some once honorable warriors have like given up because they've been on the front lines for too long and like have settled in and made peace with the local farmers because it's 100 years of war. So like these guys have been on the front lines so long that they have
Yeah.
more in common with their immediate opposites than they do.
Turns out fighting for the Fire Nation army is not conducive to long term health. So some dudes abandon their post and are like, actually, the Earth Kingdom has it figured out. I just kind of want to live this rural agrarian life.
Right. And so then some like fresh Fire Nation troops arrive. Do you take the opportunity to root these firebenders out of
Oh,
this town? Or do you side with the firebenders who have become naturalized home?
maybe even more
Or
conflicting is some fresh faced Earthbender troops arrive and they're like, oh
mm,
no, you're one of the bad guys. And they're like, yeah, but I've lived in this community for 15 years. I've got children here. Like, I've defended against Fire Nation incursions. And you're
yeah,
like, okay, so what's the right thing to do here?
right. So we have a character who we know is going to be like, well, they're deserters and they're
Hmm.
dishonorable and they should be evicted. And we know we
Hmm.
have a character who's like, no, rules exist to serve us, not the other way around. And we know we should bend the rules if it's the right thing to do. And those characters are going to have very different points of view on what the right way to deal with this situation is. And off we go. Like
Hmm. So I
that's
think that's
that's
very
it.
much how we structure every
Let's
session.
let's go.
This is
What are
the
we going to do about
epitome
this?
of the GM doesn't plan the solution. You just have to make the situation and then see what happens at the table.
Yeah. And so I think what I would prep is a couple of, again, thinking back to like the structure of the show, I would plan some like ad break cliffhangers that will like nudge the plot along. So I
Hmm.
think in this
Like,
example scenario, it's like we arrive and we find out that someone's a firebender. Like, oh
mhm.
shit, there's
Like
firebenders in
the
this
plot
village.
hooks are all, oh
What are
yeah,
we
you
gonna
see
do?
this guy do some firebending. You
What are we
see
gonna
him
do?
heat his cup of tea.
Yeah. So it's like, what are we going to do? Are we going to report them to the authorities? Next ad break is like, oh, it turns out that everyone knows that they've just settled in. But then you see the Earth Kingdom troops on the horizon. So, like, I
Mhm.
would come up with a handful, 2 or 3 is probably plenty for a session of just little, like, nudges to, like, kick the story on a
So this
step.
is what I would call a proactive node, something that happens to the players and then they react to that.
Yeah. And they don't have to have solved the first one before the
Hmm.
second one comes into play.
Exactly. Like this
Um,
is something that
the
occurs at.
problems are allowed to compound. And so yeah, I think that's what I would do. I would have one little situation per episode, and each session, each episode, we play that through to completion. I would be pretty tight on the pacing. I would be introducing
Hmm.
those proactive nodes. Proactive nodes sounds very technical. I want to call them kicks. I would have my little clock up on the
Hmm.
table. I'd be like, all right, we've got a 3 hour session. Like, no matter where we're at after hour one, I'm gonna
You get kicked on the hour.
you get kicked. In
I
that way,
also love it in this type of story, you don't need a resolution. In this
yeah,
situation, it can finish with a like, oh yeah, they end up taking that guy off screen, and like
like
you have to deal with the consequences of inaction.
yeah. And
That's
so
a
it's like,
legitimate
okay, well
thing, and we still have a satisfying ending.
right. So they cart all of the firebenders off to Lake Laogai, and then when you visit Ba Sing Se, suddenly there are some people.
Reintroduce that story element.
Right. So suddenly you've got something that you can pick back up.
Mhm.
And are they happy to see you? Are they not happy to see you? Like it
Mhm.
kind of depends on how
That's a
you've.
great point. At the end of every session, I'm going to take stock of what's happened, and I'm going to make note of which characters should be reintroduced later.
Right. And maybe it's completely wrapped up. I think this one that we've come up with is right before either you've got some new Firebender allies or you have some
Mhm.
Firebenders in a prison somewhere who are unhappy to see you. And ditto, you've got some Earth Kingdom soldiers who either you've won over to your like ideas about balance or who think you are dangerous criminals who are aiding and abetting the Firebenders. And all of those groups can pop back up later if you need them. Um,
Mhm.
so I think keeping track of those becomes really important. Um,
Great
or,
index cards.
or
Just rifle through them and be like, is it time for this person to come back again? Does it
yeah,
fit with the narrative?
and those are the best parts of the show is when it's like, oh my god, it's that guy, he's
Yeah.
back.
Also, just while we're talking about how you're prepping these individual sessions, you have like 60 episodes to mine content from.
Oh yeah,
It's like
just
Rocky brings up the Fire Nation prison. That was in top of my mind this whole time, and like that specific location could be the culminating thing for each of these sub arcs. So you're like,
right.
okay, yep, let's pick this like very thematic finish.
This
This
iconic
one's
spot
about
from the
prisoners of
show.
war.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
And then we wrap up this story by doing a prison break. And we have that touch point, that almost fan service. Uh, you don't have to build everything from scratch because this world already exists. You can just play off the things that already exist.
yeah. So yeah, I think that's how I am structuring the session, and I am
Mhm.
absolutely making sure that we, in one way or another, that adventure is finished at the end of the session. Maybe the finale is a two-parter, but like
Mhm.
I think again, the episodic nature of the show, the fact that we want each show to have a little arc or each episode to have a little arc and feel finished.
Mhm.
This is not a game where you want to stop mid plot. So I am going to be pulling out all of those, I guess, editing tools that I have at my disposal to like make sure that we go straight to the action. We're not narrating all the in-betweensy bits. We are
Mhm.
skipping to the good bit. We're using those little kicks to keep things moving, and to keep escalating the plot. And then when the situation is resolved, we're like, okay, that's the end. That's the end of the episode.
Mhm.
And maybe we have a little end of episode like,
I'd like a little denouement on there.
yeah, almost like a credits scene or something.
And I think if you got a character sheet in whatever system we're running this in, all of the changes happen at that point at the table immediately after the session finishes.
Right. And it's at that point at the end of the episode when you're reflecting that your rapid alignment shift occurs.
Mhm.
Um, Not that I'm a particularly big fan of D&D style alignment, but if you think about that as like, where does your character sit on particular axes
Mm.
and how have they shifted over the course of this episode? How did your moral compass change during this episode?
Everyone's could be character specific, but you've still got that spectrum from one end to the other, from like strict lawfulness to absolute lawlessness, or honor to whatever carefree life you want to lead. That's the opposite of honor. I don't have an answer to that off the top of my head. So, quick recap on this.
Yeah.
We're building in a couple of themes, one overarching theme per arc. We have an idea of what the final conclusion event will be, and then we go back and we create our party together, and you notify the characters, hey, this is the frame that's going to take place. You're going to be in these types of locations, and you're going to be facing off against these types of themes. So build a character that works in that way. And then session by session, you're doing that intersection of what's the theme, what are some character things that I can play off against each other. If you can hit the holy one where everyone would have an opinion on this, that's the dream.
I mean, that's the season finale, right? That's maybe the one you design as your
Like
season finale and then work back from there.
if you're ending with all of them intersecting on this thing after 12 sessions of play, have they come to an alignment, or are you going to still have that tension between them in the moment? Like, I think either one of those situations is an excellent story that's been told.
And like either of those scenarios is going to be great fun to
Mhm.
play through for the characters.
Yeah.
Um,
And then we're throwing down like some some situations. We spin up a couple of characters for them.
Mm.
Each one of those characters is an index card. It's so convenient. And you're building your deck of characters as the sessions go on, choosing when to reintroduce them. But then you also have your kicks. So for each particular session, what are some interesting events that would occur in this situation that will spark action, that will force the players to move? I think that's a really good, clean way of approaching prepping a thing that's going to hit these story elements.
Yeah.
So let's talk systems. How do we actually game it?
Okay. I actually recently bought a Humble Bundle, which had the Avatar Legend. I think it's called Avatar Legends. It had the Avatar The Last Airbender RPG in it, which is a powered by the Apocalypse system. And I was skeptical going in. I haven't played it yet, but I really, really want to, because I think for once the official tie-in system actually gets a lot of this stuff right. Actually, you know what? Let me get the file up. So your stats are creativity, focus, harmony, and passion. So these are your like overall this system's equivalents of like strength, dexterity, intelligence, and charisma, right? These are the bonuses that you add to things, right? Is like, how creative are you? Instead of hit points, you have fatigue, and you have a stress track that is called balance.
Mm-hmm.
And your balance is tipped one way or the other between two opposing ideals. So
Perfect.
some of them are loyalty and confidence, right? So loyalty to your friends, but like the confidence and independence to act on your own. Self-reliance and trust.
Mm.
Force and care, right? As
Mm.
ideals. And the set of opposing ideals that you have is what defines your character class. So there's no like firebender class or swordsman class. The class is the hammer. And your balance is force and care. And there are interesting ways for you to like spend it, but also the more you spend, the more unbalanced you get, the closer you are to like tipping off one extreme or the other. So it's like both a good thing and a bad thing to tip your balance. But you are like an incredibly forceful character, but also like an incredibly caring character. And your job as a player is to exploit these two poles for mechanical effect, right? It's like this session, it would work for me to deploy force. And so like I'm going to tip myself towards the force end of this balance, but that's going to have consequences for me later, especially if you tip off the end, then you are like knocked out of that scene. And then from the next episode on, your balance starts permanently shifted one towards that
I
extreme.
like that. So you have the acute in session swings, and then you have a permanent shift towards swinging that way more often.
Right. And then the rule is that if you ever hit one extreme or the other with your center, so if your starting position ever hits one of those extremes, that's it. Your character has discovered who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And
Do they get retired after that?
their story is over. Your character had a tension between force and care, and they came down on the side of force, and they know who they are now. Their story is over, and it is time to like find a new character and play through their story, because this character has decided, you have decided as a player who this character is by your actions, by choosing force over care every time. And so it's this beautiful distillation of the philosophy of like, you're not who you say you are, you are how you act.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, look, honestly, that sounds like it's tightly aligned to what we were just discussing.
I wrote down all this stuff that I wanted from an ideal Avatar The Last Airbender game, and then I was like, oh my gosh, that, like, again, haven't played it. Really
Mm-hmm.
excited to try. Uh, there's this really interesting mechanic where you can call someone out on their values.
It's like if
Um,
they act in a way that's not in accordance with their values.
yeah, and that's like a mechanical thing that you can do, is call someone out.
Yes,
Um,
see, that's what you need. Like, there has to be a mechanical reason. Like, I'm very much in the system support style of play. Not
Yeah.
every system works for every genre. And in this one, if you want intra-party conflict to be a thing, you got to have a mechanical benefit for calling them out.
Right. And so you can either resist being called out and say like, no, this is in line with my values because of this, or you can lean into it and like, I think it's really interesting. I think it would be quite challenging to play with people who have only played D&D before, but I
Uh,
am so excited to try it.
this is something that I was going to bring up in the like, would you run this? What we normally ask, but the answer is hesitantly yes, because it depends so much on having players that will do these things, and that you might actually need to coach them how to do that. And
Absolutely.
like
Maybe even
with
have a little like rewatch of the show. And it's like, okay, what happened in this episode? Yes, there was some cool martial arts stuff, but also like everybody
Mm.
talked about their feelings. And that is what
like
we need.
someone who's only played D&D doesn't have those tools to explore a character like that. Yeah, I think that'll
Yeah.
be tough.
Yeah.
I think it'll be
Oh,
incredibly rewarding though.
absolutely. So yeah, I don't know. I love that aspect of it. If I were to try and run it in a different system, I would shamelessly steal just that core mechanic.
I
I
think
don't
that core mechanic sounds very strong. Yeah.
yeah.
So I was thinking about this as well, and you've just said I would shamelessly steal that. I was thinking something like a resistance toolkit from like Spire or Heart, but with radically different flavors.
Mm,
So like in Inspire and Heart, you have different stress tracks against each of your like 5 resistances. And
mhm,
one is like blood or body, one is against your mind, one is against your money, one is against your ability to be hidden called shadow, and one is against your reputation. And I think you can reflavor those. There's something that you implied with all of the stuff you were just saying. Yeah, you might get injured in the fight. You are never killed in the fight.
no.
When they
Yeah.
lose the fight, they escape in a wounded way and have taken fallout from that,
Mm,
but they don't die. So I think you could really, like, if you wanted to hack a system to make it work for you, I would go with the resistance and I would hack those 5 different stress tracks so that it reflects the values that we've been talking about on screen, and then the fallouts that you suffer for them as you accrue stress and they turn from like the abstract number on the sheet to a concrete story element. I would choose ones that reflect really tightly to things in the screen,
I mean,
things in the fiction.
this almost feels like something you could hack together, right? Like if you've got 5 stress tracks and 5 players at the table, it's like, okay, everyone pick your character's like core value.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it is like loyalty or honor or whatever. And then you make those the 5 stress tracks.
Yeah.
Everyone knows then how they sit in relation to the other characters because you've picked those core mechanical pieces based on like the things that everybody wants to test, but then you like cross pollinate them so that everyone is then being tested on each other's things.
Yes.
Um,
And
and
the
so
the
we have
way that you remove stress is by acting in accordance with your value. The better you are at that, the more stress you remove from your character because you're acting in accordance with that character's narrative, like core. I think you can really easily adapt that to be like, if I'm the honorable character, then by acting with honor in here, I will remove stress against my other things.
I actually really love the idea. If I had a very creative group, I'd be like, okay, we're going to hack this system together.
Mhm,
We're going to decide what the themes you want to talk about this season are, and we're going to define our
mhm.
characters based on those themes that we
Yeah.
decided
To have a
together.
Ripper session 0 where you build out the way you're going to play it and the
Yeah,
themes you're going to play through.
yeah. And I think would be equally excited to play through that. Um,
Now,
with the right group, which brings me to
critical question.
the second last question, which is, would you run this?
So I would, with the same caveats I had before, I would want players who know coming into it that their character is not a static object.
Mm,
And the way that they play that character is going to have to evolve over time with the choices that they make. I don't want someone who's coming in with the mind of a dungeon crawler to play this type of
Yeah.
game with me.
So similar for me, I have a caveat as well. And I think my caveat is that I would want people who are familiar with the show and
Yeah.
really liked the show. So much of the joy of playing in an established setting is getting to drop little bits of fan service in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I want players who are going to know what to do if I put a cabbage merchant in the square. Right? Like I want people who I'm like, oh yeah, and there's a guy selling cabbages over the other side of the square,
Yes.
and I want players who will make a note of that and make sure that they trash that guy's cabbage
Mm-hmm.
cart on the way out. Yeah, never on purpose, but I want players who will
Yeah.
make sure that the cabbage cart gets upset by the end of the episode. Again, the great thing about doing stuff based on TV shows is you can pull out the soundtrack, you can pull out the music, you can pull out
Mm-hmm.
all the maps. There's just this already, as you said, a beautiful library of visual prompts for you to steal from. Just go
Okay,
screenshot parts of the
one
show.
more aesthetic choice is that you take the opening song that plays in the background of Katara's voiceover, and then you come up with your own one for your group
Oh,
that's
absolutely.
about your story, and I
Yes.
believe that we can stop the warlord, something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
So, critical question here. Would you run this in 5e? How would you do it? Let me shortcut all this discussion. No.
Would I run this in 5e? Okay, I think it would be really hard because the 5e lore and the 5e mechanics are very tightly integrated. So I think you end up having to do one of those total conversion-esque
Yep.
mods where you are banning classes left and right.
And
Yeah,
because it's a very crunchy kind of game, you also want to make sure your numbers are balanced.
right. If I am ripping wizards, clerics,
Druids.
sorcerers, druids, probably ripping a bunch of stuff out of Ranger,
It's
banning a
very
bunch of subclasses, I'm banning arcane trickster. At that
okay.
point,
Maybe the way that you do this is you ban every single class and subclass except Monk Way of the Four Elements, and
I
then you
think
dramatically buff all of the shit in there so that they can use their fun tools, and you restrict all of the things that they can do to a specific flavor.
yeah, again, I feel like
But even then, that's not going to capture the feeling.
if you had players who flatly refused to play anything else, you'd be like, okay, we are all picking different monk subclasses, not so much the shadows one, but the straight up punching and kicking type one.
Mm-hmm. Open
Also
hand.
works for the martial type characters. Great. We will do oops all monks, and I will bolt something onto the key point system. These monks will munch down as many key points as you can give them. That's one of the
I
flaws of
think
the
there has
class.
to be a give and a take, like a refresh your key points ability by acting in story accordance or something like that.
Exactly. So that's kind of where we bolt on these balancy concepts, these acting in accordance with your core values concepts, these making a hard decision type stuff is writing a tight little set of rules to pay players in key points to power their abilities. And then maybe alongside it, we remove some of the key refresh from resting. You have to talk about your feelings to refresh your key.
The thing that's always going to stick with me, though, is that at the end of the day, most of your abilities are about killing things by subtracting numbers from their total. There's still something incredibly lame about going up against the Fire Nation Lieutenant and then just whittling him down with your yep, now I'm going to earthbend at his feet and throw a boulder, and that does 7 damage.
And there's no way to capture the moral battle that's happening at the same time.
Yeah.
There's no
Yeah,
way
that's
to
actually one of the biggest sticking points that I had GM in 5e was having a warrior, a fighter, mid battle try to convince guys that what they were doing was wrong and that they needed to ease up. So it's okay, well, make a persuasion check. And of course, he's a fighter, so his charisma sucks. So it just doesn't happen.
all
So
right,
it's
I guess I keep
ah,
fighting them.
yep. sorry. And I'm like, oh, that does feel really bad. I don't like that.
You could probably recapture some of those moves from the Avatar Legends game, the calling out and the like, why are you doing this type like question. Like you could capture those, I think, by writing custom monk abilities, which
We just introduce them all as combat moves. Wink,
like,
wink.
basically yes. But I don't know. That's just so much work.
I know.
I would.
It's really trying to force a porcupine-shaped peg into any goddamn shape of hole.
Yeah. You do hit a
Yeah.
point where it's like, it is much easier if we just play the system that is designed for this.
Well,
So that's Avatar.
it.
That's the Last Airbender.
We solved the Last Airbender.
We brought balance to the world.
Cardinal sin, I have not changed as a character.
I don't want you to, buddy. That's okay.
No.
This has been an episode of Playtonics, Playtonics. You can find us at thoseletters.net, and also wherever you get your podcasts these days.
If you have enjoyed this episode, then send it through to your GM friends. And if you're a GM, send it through to your players.
We would love to help some of you bust out of whatever little 5e box you're in and try something a little bit different.
Tell some different stories.
Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will catch you next month with another little spicy episode.
Bye!
Bye!